The final hiss of steam was a weary sigh, a sound of surrender that echoed in Isabel Faraday's own heart. The train, a great iron beast that had carried her across 1,000 miles of unforgiving country, shuddered to a halt, its final groan of steel on the steel, a punctuation mark at the end of a long and painful sentence. For a moment, she remained in her seat, her fingers laced tightly over the worn handle of the small wooden chest in her lap. Outside the grimy window, the world was a smear of gray and brown, a place that had not yet decided if it was late autumn or early winter. The conductor's call, muffled by the thick glass, finally spurred her to move. Dust River, end of the line. End of the line. The words felt heavier than they should. Isabel rose, her limbs stiff from the long journey. She was a slight figure, made smaller by the vast, empty landscape waiting for her. Her dress, a practical gray wool, was clean but frayed at the cuffs, a testament to a life of making do. Her bonnet, tied firmly beneath her chin, did little to shield her face from the biting wind that immediately greeted her as she stepped from the relative warmth of the carriage onto the narrow platform. It was a wind with teeth. It snaked under the collar of her thin coat and seemed to search for the very marrow in her bones. She pulled her shawl tighter, her gaze sweeping over the collection of unpainted, wind-scoured buildings that constituted the town of Dust River. It was less a town and more a temporary argument against the wilderness. A single muddy street, already beginning to harden with frost, separated a general store from a saloon, from which the boisterous sound of male laughter and the tinny plink of a poorly tuned piano spilled out into the cold air. A blacksmith's shop stood dark and silent at the far end, its forge cold. There was a livery, a small church with a leaning steeple, and not much else. The train, her last link to the world she had known, let out a mournful whistle. With a great chuffing of steam and a clanking of couplings, it began to pull away, gathering speed as it retreated back the way it had come. Isabel watched it go, a knot tightening in her stomach as its rhythmic clatter faded, leaving behind a silence that was vast and profound, the silence of the plains. Now, she was truly alone. She had been told someone would be here to meet her. A letter, written in a surprisingly neat hand on thick, expensive paper, had offered her the position of seamstress at the Holt Horse Ranch, a place some miles north of town. The pay was modest, but it included room and board. More importantly, it was an escape. It was a chance to put an entire state between herself and the ghost of a life that had been promised and then cruelly snatched away. She scanned the platform again, but it was empty save for a few discarded crates and a tumbleweed pinned against the station wall. No one. A fresh gust of wind whipped a loose strand of her auburn hair across her face. She shivered, not entirely from the cold. Her grip tightened on the wooden chest. It was all she had. Inside, nestled among a few changes of clothes, were her mother's sewing shears, a collection of thimbles worn smooth with use, a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and the last of her meager savings. The chest smelled of cedar and lavender, the scent of a home that no longer existed. Her mother, a seamstress of quiet renown in a bustling Ohio town, had passed from a fever in the spring. It was a grief so sharp and sudden that Isabel still felt its ache with every breath. But another, more complicated grief followed close behind. Thomas Crowley, the man who had courted her for a year, who had spoken of a shared future and a home filled with children, had withdrawn his proposal just 2 weeks after the funeral. He had done it so politely, so reasonably, that it made the cruelty of it all the more sharp. They had met in the small parlor of the home she and her mother had shared, the air still thick with the scent of morning flowers. He had not met her eye. He had spoken of unforeseen circumstances and social complications. It was only when she pressed him, her voice trembling, that he had finally uttered the truth, his words as cold and hard as river stones. A rival for his affections, a spiteful woman from a prominent family, had unearthed the secret of Isabel's birth, the secret her mother had guarded so carefully for 24 years. Isabel Faraday was illegitimate, the product of a brief, regrettable affair between a gifted seamstress and a wealthy man who had passed through town and never looked back. The Faraday name was her mother's, not a father's she had never known. "A man in my position," Thomas had said, studying his perfectly manicured nails, "must consider his reputation. My family, they would not understand." He had not said he was sorry for her loss, or for the pain his words were causing. He had simply looked at her as if she were a flawed piece of merchandise he had decided against purchasing. The love he had professed, the future he had painted for them, it had all been conditional, a contract voided by a single, shameful clause in her history. He had not seen her, the woman he claimed to love. He had seen only the stain of her birth. That rejection had been a different kind of death. It had hollowed her out, leaving behind a brittle shell of shame and loneliness. The pitying glances of the townspeople, the whispers behind cupped hands, had become unbearable. So when the letter from the Holt Ranch arrived, a response to an advertisement she had placed in a newspaper, a desperate, hopeful cast into the unknown, it had felt like a lifeline, a chance to go somewhere no one knew her name, where the word bastard was not whispered behind her back. But now, standing alone on this desolate platform, a sliver of fear, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced through her resolve. What if the letter was a mistake? What if they had changed their minds? What if this was all some terrible, cosmic joke? The light was beginning to fail, the sky turning a bruised purple at the edges. The cold was becoming more intense, a physical presence that pressed in on her. From the saloon, the sounds grew louder, more raucous. A door swung open, and a trio of cowboys stumbled out, their face flushed with drink. They were loud and rough, their spurs jingling with every unsteady step. They saw her immediately. A lone woman on the train platform at dusk was a curiosity, a rare bird in this land of hard men and harder living. Their conversation faltered, replaced by low murmurs and appraising stares. They did not approach, but their collective gaze felt like a physical touch, unwelcome and invasive. She could feel their eyes measuring her, speculating. She turned her head away, fixing her gaze on the distant, flat horizon, hoping her rigid posture would signal a clear desire to be left alone. One of them hooted with laughter at some shared joke, and the sound made her flinch. She thought of Thomas and his concern for his reputation. Here, in this wild place, reputation was a different currency. A woman's virtue was her shield, and without the protection of a husband or a father, she was vulnerable. She was an unknown quantity, and the unknown was often treated with suspicion, or worse, with predatory interest. She hugged the chest to her body, its solid weight a small comfort. It was a link to her mother, to a life of quiet dignity and hard work. Her mother had faced the world alone and had raised a daughter with skill and grace. Despite the shadow of her past, Isabel drew on that memory, a small reservoir of inherited strength. She would not crumble. She had survived grief and betrayal. She would survive this. But what was she to do? The station house was dark, its windows vacant eyes staring out at the dying day. The thought of walking into the saloon, of asking for directions or help amidst that sea of leering men, was unthinkable. It would be an invitation for trouble she was not equipped to handle. The general store looked closed, a handwritten sign tacked to its door. The temperature continued to drop. The mud in the street was now frozen solid, patterned with the prints of horseshoes and wagon wheels. She could feel the cold seeping through the soles of her worn boots. She had to make a decision. She could not simply stand here and freeze. Perhaps she could ask for a room at the church. A man of God might offer sanctuary. Or perhaps she could find the livery and inquire about hiring a horse and buggy, though the thought of navigating an unfamiliar road in the dark was terrifying, and her funds were perilously low. She had to make every penny count until she could begin earning her keep. She shifted her weight, the movement a small protest against the paralysis of fear that had taken root. She took a deep breath, the frigid air stinging her lungs. She would walk to the general store first, just to be sure it was closed. It was a small, simple plan, but it was something. It was a step. She would not be a victim of circumstance, a solitary figure waiting for a rescue that might never come. She was Isabel Faraday, her mother's daughter, a seamstress. Her hands were capable. Her spirit, though bruised, was not broken. Clutching the handle of her chest with one hand and gathering her coat with the other, she squared her shoulders. The cowboys were still watching, their curiosity piqued by her stillness. Let them watch. She took a determined step off the platform, her boot landing with a soft crunch on the frozen ground. The silence that followed was broken only by the lonely whistling of the wind through the eaves of the station. She was a stranger in a strange land, with nothing but a wooden box and a painful past. But she was moving forward. It was all she could do. Just as the toe of her boot met the frozen earth and she braced herself for the walk toward the darkened general store, a voice cut through the wind. It was a low, calm sound, a deep baritone that seemed to absorb the cold rather than be carried away by it. "I'm late. My apologies, miss." Isabel froze, her heart giving a sharp, painful leap against her ribs. The voice had come from the shadows near the station house, a place she had assumed was empty. She turned slowly, her hand still clenched around the handle of her chest, her body coiled with a defensive tension she couldn't suppress. A man was walking toward her. He was tall, his frame made broader by a heavy, dark coat lined with what looked like wolf fur at the collar. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. But she could see he was not one of the drunken cowboys from the saloon. There was a deliberation in his step, a quiet confidence that was entirely different from their boisterous swagger. He moved with the easy grace of a man who was comfortable in his own skin and in the vast, empty spaces of the land around him. As he drew closer, he pushed the brim of his hat up with his thumb, revealing his face in the fading light. His hair was a dark, rich brown, thick and unruly where it escaped his hat. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes and mouth that spoke of long days spent outdoors. They were not lines of cruelty, but of experience. His eyes, she saw, were a startlingly clear shade of gray, the color of a winter sky just before a storm. They were steady and direct, and they held no trace of the leering curiosity she had felt from the other men. They simply saw her. "Miss Faraday," he asked, his voice even. "I'm Jack Holt, from the ranch." Relief washed over Isabel so powerfully it almost buckled her knees. It was followed by a flicker of annoyance at her own panic, at the way the world had taught her to expect the worst from men. She managed a small, stiff nod. "Mr. Holt. I had begun to think I was not expected. A lame horse and a broken harness pin say otherwise," he said, a faint, wry smile touching his lips, but not quite reaching his eyes. "It's a poor welcome to Dust River. I am sorry for it." He looked from her face to the wooden chest she held clutched against her like a shield. Without another word, he reached out. "Allow me." His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked for his living. For a split second, she hesitated, her grip tightening instinctively. It was her whole world in that box. He seemed to understand. He didn't pull or insist. He simply waited, his hand outstretched, his gray eyes patient. Slowly, she relinquished her hold. He took the chest from her, and its weight seemed to be nothing to him. "My wagon is just yonder," he said, gesturing with his head toward the livery. "It'll be warmer than standing out here." He turned and began to walk, not waiting to see if she would follow, assuming she would. And she did. She fell into step a few paces behind him, watching his broad back. The cowboys, who had been observing the exchange from their post outside the saloon, seemed to lose interest now that she was in the company of a man like Jack Holt. They turned back to their own amusements, and Isabel felt the weight of their gaze lift from her shoulders. The wagon was a simple, sturdy buckboard, hitched to a team of two strong-looking horses who stood placidly, their breath pluming in the frigid air. "Mr." Holt placed her chest carefully in the back and then turned to her. He put his hands on her waist to help her up onto the seat, and his touch was firm and impersonal, a simple act of assistance. Still, after so long without any gentle human contact, the warmth of his hands through her coat was a small shock. She settled herself on the wooden bench, pulling her skirts primly around her ankles. He walked around to the other side and climbed up beside her, the wagon shifting under his weight. He took a heavy wool blanket from behind the seat and, with a deft flick of his wrists, unfolded it and laid it across her lap, tucking it in around her sides. "The wind bites tonight," was all he said by way of explanation. He took up the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, the horses started forward, their hooves making a crisp, rhythmic clopping on the frozen road. They moved out of the meager collection of buildings and into the open country. The last vestiges of light were draining from the sky, leaving the world in shades of deep indigo and charcoal. The plain stretched out around them, a vast, silent sea of dormant grass, now dusted with a fine layer of snow that shimmered like crushed diamonds in the moonlight that was beginning to assert itself. The silence in the wagon was as vast as the landscape. "Mr." Holt did not seem to be a man for idle chatter, and Isabel was grateful for it. She had no desire to recount the details of her journey or answer polite, meaningless questions about her past. She had spent months deflecting the pity and curiosity of others, and the quiet was a balm. And yet, it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a shared quiet, a mutual acknowledgement of the cold and the dark and the long road ahead. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the soft snorting of the horses. From time to time, she would steal a glance at the man beside her. His profile was stark against the darkening sky, his jaw set as he focused on the road. He handled the reins with an economy of movement that was mesmerizing to watch, his hands gentle but firm, guiding the horses with an instinct born of long practice. She was aware, as the miles fell away behind them, that he was watching her, too. He was not staring. His eyes remained on the path ahead, but she could feel his attention on her. A quiet, steady awareness. It was in the way he angled his body slightly toward her, as if to shield her from the worst of the wind. It was in the brief, assessing glance he would give the blanket, ensuring it had not slipped. It was a watchfulness that felt protective. It was a foreign feeling, and one she did not know what to do with. Thomas had looked at her as an ornament, something to possess and display. The cowboys in town had looked at her as a novelty, a potential source of amusement. This man, this stranger, looked at her as if she were a person who might be cold, who might be tired, who might be frightened. It was a look that afforded her a measure of dignity she had not felt in a very long time. "First time this far west?" he asked, his voice startling her out of her thoughts. "Yes," she replied, her own voice sounding small in the immense quiet. He nodded, a short, sharp dip of his chin. "It takes some getting used to. The quiet, the size of it all." "It's very empty," she offered. He considered this for a moment. "It's full of life," he said finally. "You just have to know where to look for it." He pointed with his chin off to the right, where a line of darker shapes broke the horizon. "Coyotes. They'll be singing to the moon soon enough." As if on cue, a lone, quavering howl rose up from the darkness, a sound of profound and ancient loneliness that sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. It was answered by another, and then another, until the air was filled with their wild, eerie music. Instead of fear, Isabel felt a strange sense of wonder. It was a raw, untamed sound, a world away from the polite, stifling parlors of her old life. They lapsed back into silence, but it felt different now, easier, He had shared something with her, a small piece of his world. After a while, he spoke again, his tone practical. "The bunkhouse is full of good men, but they're rough around the edges. They'll keep their distance if you want them to. If any of them give you trouble, you come to me." "Thank you," she said softly. "The owner, Mr. Silas Holt, is my uncle," he continued, as if needing to clarify his position. "He's in Denver on business for the winter. It's just me in the hands until spring." He paused. "And you, now." "And you, now." The words hung in the air. She was a part of this place now, an unknown element introduced into a closed system. She wondered what he thought of that, having a lone woman on a ranch full of men. He gave no indication. His voice remained level, factual. The cold was seeping deeper into her bones now, a persistent, numbing ache. She huddled further into the blanket. Without a word, Jack Holt slowed the horses, reached behind the seat again, and produced a thick sheepskin coat. "Here," he said, holding it out. "Put this on over yours. It's warmer." "Oh, I couldn't," she began. "The protest automatic." "You can, and you will," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I've no need for a frozen seamstress." The statement was blunt, but there was no heat in it. It was simple pragmatism. She took the coat. It was heavy and smelled of leather, horses, and the clean, sharp scent of the winter air. It smelled of him. She slipped it on over her own thin coat, and the warmth was immediate and profound. It was like stepping into a cocoon. The sleeves were far too long, and the shoulders were comically broad. But she felt a sense of security she couldn't explain. She was wrapped in his warmth, in his protection. She murmured another thank you, her voice muffled by the thick collar. He just grunted in response, a sound of acknowledgement, and urged the horses back to their steady pace. The moon was high now, a perfect silver disk in a black velvet sky littered with a breathtaking spray of stars. They were brighter here, sharper than any she had ever seen. They seemed close enough to touch. The world had been reduced to the narrow, rutted track ahead, illuminated by the bobbing yellow light of the single lantern hanging from the wagon's side. It was a small, moving island of warmth and light in a vast, cold, and beautiful darkness. For the first time since her mother's death, Isabel felt a flicker of something that was not grief, or shame, or fear. It was a quiet sense of peace. She was no longer running from a past that could not be undone. She was moving towards something. She did not know what it was, and the uncertainty was still a knot in her stomach. But it was a beginning. She glanced at the man beside her again, in the shifting lantern light. His face was all angles and shadows. He seemed as much a part of this landscape as the frozen earth and the coyote's call solid, enduring, and quiet. He did not ask her where she had come from, or why she had come. He did not ask her about her family or her prospects. He had simply met her train, wrapped her in a blanket, and was taking her home. It was more kindness than she had been shown in months. Ahead, in the distance, a pinprick of yellow light appeared, then another, and another. A homestead. "That's it," Jack Holt said, his voice low. "That's the ranch." Isabel stared at the lights. Her new home. They were a promise of warmth, of shelter. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to feel a fragile, tentative sliver of hope. The wagon wheels crunched over a layer of frost-hardened gravel as they turned into the ranch yard. The space was flanked by a long, low-slung main house with a deep porch, a separate, smaller building from which the sound of men's voices could be heard, the bunkhouse, she presumed, and a massive barn that loomed dark against the starry sky. Corrals, sturdy and well-maintained, branched off from the barn, holding the dark, shifting shapes of horses. The air was thick with the honest, earthy smells of hay, animals, and the wood smoke that curled from the stone chimneys of the house and bunkhouse. It smelled like a place of hard work and purpose. Jack Holt brought the team to a halt in the center of the yard. He set the brake, wrapped the reins, and hopped down from the wagon with a soft thud of boots on the ground. He came around to her side, his face once again shadowed by the brim of his hat. "This is it," he said, his voice low in the quiet yard. He offered a hand to help her down, and she took it, her own small hand disappearing into his rough, warm grasp. For a moment, she just stood there, taking it all in. This was her new world. It was stark and overwhelmingly masculine, a place of function over form. Yet there was a sense of order to it, of things being in their proper place. "The main house is there," he said, gesturing with his head. "Kitchen's at the back. Cook's name is Jebediah. He's deaf in his left ear and meaner than a cornered badger, but his biscuits are the best in the territory." A ghost of a smile played on his lips. "Your room is this way." He didn't lead her toward the main house, as she might have expected, nor the bunkhouse. Instead, he walked toward the great barn. He retrieved her wooden chest from the back of the wagon, hoisting it to his shoulder as if it were a sack of feathers, and led her to a narrow door set into the side of the massive structure, separate from the main barn doors. He produced a key from his pocket, unlocked the door, and pushed it inward. He stepped inside and struck a match, the sudden flare of light casting his silhouette in sharp relief. He lit an oil lamp that sat on a small table just inside the door, and as the wick caught, a warm, yellow glow spread through the space, pushing back the shadows. He set the lamp down and turned to her. "In here." Isabel stepped over the threshold and paused, her eyes adjusting to the light. It was a small, simple room, but it was impeccably clean. The walls were made of thick, planed wood, and the floor was swept bare. To one side stood a narrow bed, covered with a thick, colorful patchwork quilt. Against the far wall was a small, pot-bellied stove, a neat stack of firewood and a bucket of kindling beside it. A sturdy wooden table, large enough for her to spread out fabric, was placed beneath the room's only window, which currently looked out into blackness. A single straight-backed wooden chair was tucked beneath it. In one corner, a simple washstand held a ceramic pitcher and basin, and a row of wooden pegs on the wall served as a closet. Jack brought her chest in and set it at the foot of the bed. He then went to the stove, knelt, and began expertly arranging the kindling inside. The metallic scrape of the stove door and the rustle of the wood were the only sounds. "There's a lock on the inside," he said, his back still to her as he worked. "You'll have your privacy. The hands know this is your space. They won't bother you." He struck another match and lit the kindling. A small flame flickered to life, and he added a few larger pieces of wood before closing the door. A gentle, radiating warmth began to fill the room almost immediately. From the other side of the wall came a soft, heavy sigh, followed by the sound of a horse shifting its weight in straw. Isabel started, her eyes going to the wall. "That's the stables," Jack explained, rising to his feet and dusting off his hands. "You'll hear the horses. I hope it won't be a bother." "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't think it will." The sound was comforting. It was a living sound, rhythmic and peaceful. He looked around the room, his gray eyes taking in every detail, as if ensuring everything was as it should be. "The privy is out back, past the water pump. I'll have one of the boys bring fresh water for your basin every morning. Jebediah leaves breakfast out in the kitchen from sunrise. You can take your other meals in there or bring them back here, whichever you prefer." He was giving her choices. He was giving her space. He was not assuming or demanding. After months of being scrutinized and judged, of having her life dictated by the whims and prejudices of others, this simple, practical respect felt like a profound gift. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the knob. He looked at her then, a long, steady look. She met his gaze, her chin held high, though she felt a tremor of exhaustion run through her. He seemed to see right through the carefully constructed wall of composure she presented to the world, to the fragile, weary woman beneath. "Get some rest, Miss Faraday," he said, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. "The work can wait till morning." And with that, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone in the warm, yellow light. The first thing she did was slide the iron bolt on the door. The solid, metallic thunk was the most reassuring sound she had ever heard. For the first time in months, since the day Thomas had walked out of her life and the whispers had started. She was in a room of her own, with a locked door. She was safe. She took off his heavy sheepskin coat, folded it carefully, and laid it on the chair. Then she walked around the small space, running her hand over the rough-hewn wood of the table, the cool ceramic of the pitcher, the soft, worn fabric of the quilt. It was all so simple, so solid. There were no frills, no pretensions. Everything in the room had a purpose. It was honest. She went to the window and peered out. She could see the main house now, its windows glowing with lamplight. She saw a figure Jack Holt cross the yard and disappear onto the porch. He did not look back. The little stove was throwing off a wonderful heat now, chasing away the last of the deep, penetrating chill from her journey. She could hear the crackle of the flames, and beyond the wall, the gentle munching of a horse eating hay. It was a symphony of simple, peaceful sounds. Overwhelmed by a wave of emotion she couldn't name, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and bone-deep weariness. She sank down onto the edge of the bed. The quilt was soft beneath her fingers. She thought of her mother, of the countless quilts she had made, her nimble fingers flying, her face serene in concentration. This quilt, with its mismatched squares of calico and flannel, had been made by a stranger's hands, but it felt like a connection to her past, to the only real security she had ever known. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. She did not bother to wipe it away. It was not a tear of sadness, but of release. The days that followed fell into a quiet, predictable rhythm. Isabel would wake early, long before sunrise, to the sounds of the ranch stirring to life, the low voices of the hands, the clatter of buckets, the nicker of a horse wanting its breakfast. These sounds, which might have once been alarming, became the reassuring backdrop to her new life. She would dress in the warmth of her room, the stove still glowing with embers from the night before, and slip across the yard to the kitchen. The kitchen was a large, warm, bustling place that smelled of coffee, bacon, and baking bread. Jebediah, the cook, was exactly as Jack had described him, a wiry old man with a fearsome scowl who communicated mostly in grunts. But on her first morning, he had silently pointed her toward a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of steak and eggs he had kept warm for her on the back of the stove. And this simple gesture was his version of a welcome. She would take her plate and a mug of steaming coffee back to her room, preferring her solitude to the boisterous camaraderie of the bunkhouse men in the kitchen. She spent her first day unpacking and setting up her workshop. She laid out her mother's shears, the steel still sharp and gleaming. She arranged her spools of thread by color on the windowsill and organized her buttons and needles in a small tin box. The wooden chest, now empty, was pushed against the wall to serve as an extra seat. The room, which had at first seemed so empty, was now hers. It was a workspace, a home. Jack had been right. The work was waiting. A large canvas sack had been left outside her door, filled with the ranch's mending. There were denim trousers with ripped knees, flannel shirts with missing buttons, heavy canvas jackets with torn seams. There were saddle blankets worn thin from use and a set of leather chaps that had been gored by a steer. The leather rent clean through. Isabel lost herself in the work. It was a comfort, a familiar world of stitches and seams. The steady, repetitive motion of the needle was a meditation. It required her full attention, leaving little room for the ghosts of the past to whisper in her ear. She was good at her work, her stitches small and even, her repairs strong. It was a skill her mother had passed down to her, a legacy more valuable than any inheritance of land or money. She saw Jack Holt every day, but rarely did they speak more than a few words. He did not seek her out for conversation, and she was grateful for the distance. Yet, she was always aware of his presence. She would see him from her window, directing the hands with quiet authority, his movements economical and sure. He had a way with the horses, a calm, steady touch that they responded to. She would see him late at night, long after the rest of the ranch had gone to bed, walking the fence line with a lantern, his solitary figure a dark shape against the vast, starry sky. He was the guardian of this place, his watchfulness a silent, encompassing blanket. Their interactions were brief and always about the work. One afternoon, he appeared at her open door, holding a heavy wool coat, its sleeve nearly torn off at the shoulder. "The bay mare spooked," he said by way of explanation. He held it out to her. She took it, examining the damage. "The fabric is torn badly. I'll need to put a patch on the inside to reinforce it before I can mend the seam." He nodded. "Do what you need to do." He hesitated for a moment, his gray eyes sweeping over her workshop, the neat spools of thread, the tidy pile of finished mending. He seemed to approve. "Jebediah says you're not eating enough to keep a bird alive." Isabel was taken aback by the personal comment. "I'm fine, Mr. Holt." "It's Jack," he said. He met her gaze, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not pity, but a kind of quiet concern. "This is hard country. You need to keep your strength up." And then he was gone, leaving her with a torn coat and a surprising warmth spreading through her chest. It was the longest conversation they'd had. Another time, she left a repaired saddle blanket, its frayed edges newly bound with sturdy linen thread, on a hook outside her door. Later that day, she found a small pail of fresh milk in its place, still warm from the cow. There was no note, no explanation. None was needed. It was their way of communicating, a silent language of work done and needs provided for. He gave her shelter and purpose. She gave him her skill. It was a fair, simple exchange, and in its simplicity, Isabel found a measure of peace she had thought she would never know again. She was no longer a shameful secret or a social complication. Here, she was the seamstress. She was useful. She had a place, and in her small, warm room, with the sound of the horses breathing on the other side of the wall, that was more than enough. The pile of mending in the canvas sack was the beginning, a test of her abilities. Once that was completed, the work began to arrive in a slow but steady stream, a silent testament to the harsh realities of life on a horse ranch. The clothes of the ranch hands told the story of their days. They were a testament to barbed wire, stubborn branches, the occasional misjudged branding iron, and the constant, abrasive wear of leather and rope. Isabel learned the men not by their faces or their voices, but by the garments they left on the hook outside her door. There was a big, broad-shouldered man whose shirts always came to her with the seams under the arms strained to their limits. There was a younger, slighter man whose denim trousers were perpetually shredded at the knees, as if he spent half his life on the ground. And there was someone who must have been a pipe smoker, for his jackets were often dotted with tiny, charred holes on the front, which she would painstakingly darn with thread matched so perfectly to the plaid wool that the repair was nearly invisible. Her room became a sanctuary of restoration. The scent of soap and hot iron mingled with the ever-present aroma of hay and horses. By the steady yellow light of her lamp, she worked her quiet magic. She developed a rhythm that was both soothing and productive. She learned the feel of different fabrics, the particular way wool stretched under the needle, the stubborn resistance of heavy canvas that required the use of a metal palm thimble to force the needle through. Her mother had taught her that mending was not just about closing a hole. It was about understanding the garment's life, reinforcing its weaknesses, and giving it the strength to endure more. The ranch hands, a rowdy and rough-edged crew when seen from a distance, were models of decorum in their dealings with her. They never approached her door when she was inside. They left their items on the hook, sometimes with a clumsily scrawled note tucked into a pocket explaining the damage. When she finished a piece, she would hang it back on the hook, and it would be gone by the next morning. Payment was never discussed. It was understood that her work was part of her keep, yet small tokens of appreciation began to appear. One morning she found a handful of wild plums, tart and sweet, in a tin cup next to her water pail. Another time, a strangely shaped, sun-bleached piece of wood, worn smooth by the river, was left on her doorstep. They were the shy, wordless offerings of men unaccustomed to expressing gratitude, and they touched her more than any polite compliment ever could have. One afternoon, a young hand named Billy, whose face was a constellation of freckles and whose energy seemed to perpetually outpace his lanky frame, knocked hesitantly at her doorframe. He was holding the sleeve of a faded blue shirt, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation. "Ma'am," he stammered, holding it out. "Old Blue got a hold of it. Was my fault. We was just playing." The sleeve was not just torn, it was shredded, the fabric ripped and worried by the ranch dog's powerful jaws. It was the kind of damage most would deem irreparable. "It was my favorite shirt," he said, his voice dropping. "My PA gave it to me." Isabel took the tattered cloth from him. She saw the desperation in his young eyes, the genuine attachment to a simple object. "Leave the rest of the shirt with it," she said gently. "Let me see what I can do." For 2 evenings, she worked on that sleeve. It was a puzzle of thread and fabric. She carefully trimmed the ragged edges, pieced together what she could, and then, using a clever technique her mother had called woven darning, she reconstructed the missing sections thread by thread. She backed the entire area with a piece of soft, thin cotton from her own dwindling supply to give it strength. When she was finished, the sleeve was no longer perfect, but it was whole. A fine web of intricate stitches covered the wound, a scar not of damage, but of healing. She hung the shirt back on the hook before she went to bed. The next morning, it was gone. In its place was a single, perfect eagle feather. Her reputation on the ranch was sealed. The winter began to settle in, the wind howling down from the mountains with a new and bitter edge. The work of the ranch moved indoors more often, focusing on repairing tack and tending to the horses. The flow of mending increased. One evening, as a fine, dry snow whispered against her window pane, a shadow fell across her doorway. She looked up from the wool sock she was darning and saw Jack Holt standing there. He wasn't dropping something off to be collected later. He was holding a long, heavy coat, and he stepped just inside the room, bringing the cold air with him. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect for being indoors, and held it in his hands. "I was hoping you might have a moment," he said. It was his duster, a coat made of oiled leather, the color of the dry earth, that she had seen him wear in all kinds of weather. It was an extension of the man himself, functional, durable, and unadorned. It was worn soft with age, molded to the shape of his body, and it carried the faint scents of wood smoke, leather, and the vast, open country. He held it out to her, and she saw a long, straight tear along the seam under the right arm, where the stitching had finally given way after years of strain. "I can fix this," she said, taking the coat from him. The leather was heavy and supple in her hands. "It will take a little while. The leather is thick." "I can wait," he said. It was a simple statement, but it changed the atmosphere in the room completely. He wasn't leaving her to her work. He was staying. He moved the pile of finished mending from the wooden chest and sat down, his presence suddenly filling the small space. He rested his forearms on his knees, his hat dangling from his fingers, and simply watched her. Isabel felt a strange flutter in her chest. She had never worked with an audience before, let alone an audience of one whose quiet presence was so potent. She turned her full attention to the coat, using the work as a shield for her sudden self-consciousness. This was not a job for a standard needle and thread. She retrieved her leather working tools from her chest, a sharp awl with a polished wooden handle, a roll of heavy, waxed linen thread, and 2 large, triangular-tipped needles. She laid the coat across her lap, smoothing the leather and aligning the edges of the tear. The room grew silent. The only sounds the hiss and crackle of the fire in the stove and the lonely moan of the wind outside. She began her work. First, she used the awl, pressing the sharp point through the tough leather, creating a new line of holes just inside the original, weakened ones. The motion required a surprising amount of strength, a steady pressure from her shoulder and wrist. Each time the awl popped through the hide, it made a small, satisfying sound. Jack didn't move a muscle. He just watched her hands, his gaze intent. She threaded the 2 needles, one at each end of a long piece of thread, and began to stitch. It was a saddle stitch, the strongest stitch there was, the kind used for making harnesses and saddles, 1 needle from the top, 1 from the bottom, passing each other through the same hole, creating a knot within the leather itself. It was slow, meticulous work. Her world shrank to the small area of damaged leather under the warm glow of the lamplight. She was aware of his breathing, a slow, steady rhythm in the quiet room. She was aware of the way the lamplight carved shadows and planes onto his face, but she did not look up. She focused on the pull of the thread, on keeping the tension even, on making each stitch a perfect echo of the one before it. This coat was his armor against the world. It had protected him from wind and rain and cold, and she felt a deep, instinctual need to make her repair worthy of that trust, to make it strong, to make it hold. Time seemed to stretch and dissolve. There was only the work, the fire, the wind, and the quiet man sitting on the chest. He had not said a word. He did not shift restlessly or clear his throat. He simply granted her the gift of his silent, unwavering attention. It was not the invasive stare of the cowboys at the station. It was something else entirely. It was a look of deep, quiet consideration. He was watching a craftswoman at her trade, and there was a profound respect in his stillness. Finally, she reached the end of the tear. She knotted the thread, her fingers working with deft precision, and snipped the ends. She ran her thumb over the new seam. It was a strong, clean line, a neat scar that would hold for years to come. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and looked up, ready to tell him she was finished. She met his eyes, and the world stopped. He was looking at her, not at the coat. His gray eyes, which she had thought of as being the color of a winter storm, were clear and deep, and held a startling warmth in the lamplight. The gaze was devoid of any question, any demand. There was no flirtation, no artifice at all. It was a look of pure, unvarnished acknowledgement. He saw her, not the seamstress, not the woman with the questionable past, but her, Isabel Faraday. He saw her skill, her concentration, her quiet competence. In that single, silent moment, she felt more seen and more understood than she had in her entire life. Thomas had looked at her with possessive pride. The gossips in her hometown had looked at her with pity and scorn. But Jack Holt looked at her with a calm, steady regard that was as solid and real as the ground beneath her feet. His presence in her small room was not an intrusion. It was a shelter. It was like standing behind a thick stone wall during a gale the wind might howl. But you were safe. You were steady. It was a presence that didn't take anything from you, but instead gave you back to yourself. A slow warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling so foreign and so welcome it almost made her dizzy. She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than was strictly necessary, unable and unwilling to look away. Finally, he blinked, breaking the spell. He stood up. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're welcome," she replied, her own voice sounding breathy. She handed the duster back to him. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting instant. He ran his hand over her repair, his thumb tracing the line of her stitches. He nodded, a small, approving gesture. He put on the coat, shrugging his broad shoulders into the familiar weight of it. It settled on him like a second skin. He picked up his hat from the chest, gave her one last, lingering look, and then he turned and left, disappearing into the swirling snow. Isabel sat frozen in her chair for a long time after he was gone, the heavy leather duster's scent of the outdoors still hanging in the warm air of her room. She raised her hand and touched her cheek. It was hot. She had mended his coat. But in the quiet of her small room, he had mended something in her, too. The snow began not as a storm, but as a rumor, a change in the quality of the light. The sun disappearing behind a high, thin veil of cloud that bleached the color from the sky, leaving it the flat, dead white of an old bone. The wind, which had been a steady, biting companion for weeks, fell away into an unnerving stillness. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. From her window, Isabel watched the horses in the corral grow restless, their heads up, their nostrils testing the air. Even the birds had gone silent. By midday, the rumor became a promise. The sky darkened to the color of a fresh bruise, and the first flakes began to drift down, lazy and uncertain, as if unsure they wanted to land. They were large, feathery flakes that melted the moment they touched the ground. But soon they were joined by others, and then by legions. The lazy drift became a determined fall, and then a slanting, wind-driven curtain that began to erase the world. The distant hills disappeared first, then the far fence line, then the bunkhouse across the yard, until all that was left was her small room, the great wall of the barn, and the swirling, hypnotic chaos of the snow. The wind returned with a vengeance, no longer a steady push but a shrieking, violent force that tore at the corners of her small cabin, seeking entry. It sounded like a living thing, a great, hungry beast clawing at the walls. The ranch, which had been a place of constant motion and sound, fell into a deep and profound quiet, the silence of a world surrendering. The hands were shut up in the bunkhouse. The horses were secure in the barn. The world had shrunk to the size of whatever shelter one could find. Isabel lit her lamp. Though it was only mid-afternoon, the storm had stolen the day. She fed her small stove, the crackle of the flames a comforting counterpoint to the howl of the wind. She tried to work, to focus on the intricate darning of a woolen glove. But her hands were restless, and her mind kept drifting to the window. The snow was piling up now, deep and pure, burying the hard, frozen ruts of the yard under a soft, immaculate blanket. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. As dusk fell, a deep, abiding loneliness began to settle over her. On a normal day, she would have crossed the yard to the warm, noisy kitchen for her meal. But the thought of battling her way through the blizzard, of pushing against that relentless wind, was daunting. She had a little bread and some dried apples in her room. It would be enough. She could stay here, in her safe, warm cocoon, until the storm passed. But the silence was beginning to feel less like peace and more like isolation. The sound of the horses on the other side of the wall was a comfort, but it was not human. She thought of Jack, wondering where he was. In the main house, probably, sitting by his own fire. The image was so clear in her mind, the solid set of his shoulders, the quiet concentration on his face. The thought of him being just across the yard, as isolated as she was, sparked a strange impulse within her. It was a foolish, bold idea, but it took root and refused to be dislodged. Jebediah always left a pot of stew on the back of the stove for anyone who missed the main dinner call. She would brave the storm. She would get her meal, and perhaps she would take a bowl to Jack. It was a simple neighborly gesture, the kind of thing anyone would do in a storm. She told herself it was just that, a simple act of practicality. But deep down, she knew it was more. It was a rebellion against the loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long. She pulled on her warmest cloak, wrapped a thick wool shawl over her head and shoulders, and took a deep breath. She unbolted the door and pushed it open. The wind tore it from her grasp and slammed it back against the wall with a deafening crack. Snow, fine and sharp as sand, drove into the room, stinging her face and stealing her breath. For a moment, she faltered. This was madness. Then she thought of the quiet man in the big, empty house, and her resolve hardened. Holding the empty kettle she would use to carry the stew, she lowered her head and plunged into the white fury. The journey across the yard was a battle. The wind was a physical wall she had to push through, and the snow was so deep it came up over the tops of her boots. The cold a shocking, instant pain against her ankles. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. The world was a churning vortex of white. She navigated by instinct, aiming for the faint, fuzzy glow of a lamp she knew was in the kitchen window. It was her lighthouse in the storm. She finally stumbled onto the porch of the main house, gasping, her cloak and hair crusted with snow. She pushed open the kitchen door and fell inside, slamming it shut against the raging storm. For a long moment, she just leaned against the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, her lungs burning from the cold air. The kitchen was vast and filled with shadows, the only light coming from a single lamp and the nascent glow of a newly kindled fire in the great stone hearth that took up most of one wall. And there, kneeling on the stone before it, was Jack. He had not heard her enter over the roar of the wind, but he must have felt the draft. He turned his head, and his eyes widened slightly in surprise as he saw her standing there, a snow-covered apparition in his doorway. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion. "Isabel," he said, his voice low. He didn't use her formal title. He used her name. "What in God's name are you doing out in this—" "The stew," she managed to say, her teeth chattering as she held up the empty kettle. "I came for my supper." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his expression a mixture of concern and something she couldn't quite decipher. He took her by the shoulders, his grip firm and warm through her wet cloak. "You could have been lost out there. You should have stayed put." "I was hungry," she said, the excuse sounding feeble even to her own ears. He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. Then, some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible shake. "Well, you're here now. Come to the fire. You're half frozen." He led her to the hearth and gently pushed her down into one of the 2 high-backed wooden armchairs that flanked it. He took her wet cloak and shawl and hung them on hooks nearby, where they immediately began to steam in the growing heat. He knelt and added another log to the fire, and it caught with a roar, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. The warmth began to seep into her, chasing away the bone-deep chill, and she let out a long, shuddering sigh. Jack went to the big cast-iron stove, lifted the heavy lid from a pot, and a cloud of fragrant steam filled the air. He ladled the thick beef stew into 2 bowls, added a chunk of Jebediah's fresh bread to each plate, and brought them to the small table near the fire. He said nothing, but the simple act of serving her, of caring for her, was more eloquent than any words. They ate in a comfortable silence, a silence made intimate by the storm that raged just outside the thick log walls. The howl of the wind was a constant reminder of the world they were shut away from. Inside, there was only the crackle of the fire, the soft clink of their spoons against their bowls, and the steady, reassuring presence of each other. The stew was hot and rich, and it warmed her from the inside out. When they were finished, Jack took their empty bowls and set them aside. He did not suggest she should return to her own room. Instead, he refilled their coffee mugs and gestured for her to move her chair closer to the fire. He took the other chair, and they sat, watching the flames dance and weave. "I saw a mountain lion once, in a storm like this," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be part of the fire's own sound. "Up in the high country, I was holed up in a line shack, no bigger than your room. The wind was screaming, just like this, and I looked out the window, and there he was, just standing in the snow, calm as you please. Wasn't bothered by it at all. He just looked at me, and then he was gone." He fell silent, staring into the flames, lost in the memory. Isabel tried to picture it, Jack, younger, trapped in a tiny cabin, face to face with that wild, untamable creature. It was a story about the lion, but it was also a story about him. "What did you do?" she asked softly. He turned his head to look at her, a faint smile on his lips. "I made sure the door was barred good and tight." And then, for the first time since she had arrived at the Holt Ranch, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Isabel laughed. It was not a small, polite titter. It was a genuine, full-throated laugh, a sound of pure, unburdened delight that seemed to bubble up from a place deep inside her that she thought had gone cold forever. The sound startled them both. She stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth, her cheeks flushing. But Jack was staring at her, his expression transformed. All the watchfulness, all the reserve, had fallen away from his face. He was looking at her as if he had just witnessed a miracle. "That's the first time I've heard you laugh," he said, his voice soft with wonder. She could only nod, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. He turned his gaze back to the fire, but she felt his attention remain on her, a warm and gentle weight. They sat in silence for a while longer, but the quality of the silence had changed again. It was no longer just comfortable. It was charged, humming with a new and delicate electricity. He looked at her again, his gray eyes deep and serious in the firelight. "Is it quiet enough for you here?" "Isabel." She knew he wasn't talking about the storm. He was asking about the turmoil she had carried inside her when she arrived, the ghosts of her past. He was asking if she had found peace. She looked around the warm, fire-lit kitchen, at the sturdy walls that held the storm at bay, at the quiet, steady man sitting across from her, and she felt a sense of belonging so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. She could not find the words to answer him, so she simply nodded. A single, deep affirmation. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that finally, truly, reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and transforming his rugged features into something handsome and gentle. The sight of it made her heart beat a little faster. The moment stretched, beautiful and fragile. The intensity of it, of his gaze, of the feelings stirring inside her, became too much. She felt a sudden, panicked need to flee, to retreat to the safety of her own room before she did something foolish. She stood up, her chair scraping softly on the stone floor. She smoothed down the front of her simple, gray wool dress, a nervous, automatic gesture. The heat from the fire was intense on her skin, and the dress suddenly felt heavy, constricting. I should go," she stammered, not looking at him. The storm. She needed an excuse to leave, something to break the spell. Her eyes darted around the room and landed on her dress, the object of her sudden discomfort. Without thinking, the words tumbled out, a strange, nonsensical question born of her flustered state. "Where should I put this?" she asked, gesturing vaguely at her own attire. He was silent. She risked a glance at him. He was still looking at her, his expression unreadable now. He had not misunderstood. He knew she wasn't asking for a place to hang her garment. He knew it was a question about everything that was unsaid between them, a question about what happened next. He rose slowly from his chair, a tall, dark shape against the fire's bright glow. He took a step toward her, and then another, until he was standing so close she had to tilt her head back to see his face. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take a fold of the gray wool dress between his thumb and forefinger. He looked from the fabric to her eyes, his own gaze dark and serious. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, quiet murmur, meant only for her, a sound that was swallowed by the fire and the wind. "Anywhere," he said, "anywhere but back on." His words hung in the air between them, as tangible and real as the heat from the fire. Anywhere but back on. It was not a command, nor was it a crude suggestion. It was an invitation, quiet and profound, offered in the heart of a storm that had shut out the rest of the world. leaving only the two of them in the flickering, golden light. The question of her dress had been a nervous misstep, but his answer was deliberate. He had taken her clumsy, frightened query and transformed it into a moment of staggering clarity. Isabel's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild bird beating against the cage of her body. Every instinct she had cultivated over the past year, every lesson learned from Thomas Crowley's cold dismissal, screamed at her to retreat, to thank him for the meal, gather her cloak, and fight her way back to the solitary safety of her room. Fear was a familiar companion, a shield she had learned to carry. To lower it now felt like the most dangerous act in the world, but as she stood there, caught in the deep, steady gravity of his gaze, she found that the fear was entangled with another feeling, something new and far more powerful. It was the trust he had so patiently earned. It was in the memory of him waiting for her on the train platform, a solid, reassuring presence in the dusk. It was in the respectful distance he had kept, the quiet way he had provided for her without ever making her feel like a burden. It was in the way he had waited, still and silent, while she mended his coat, his attention a gift of quiet validation. This man had never asked for anything from her, and now, in this moment, he was not taking, he was offering. She looked at his face, really looked at it, past the rugged lines and the weather-beaten skin. She saw the patience in his eyes, the absence of any guile. He was not moving, not pressuring her. He was waiting, allowing the choice to be entirely her own. He was giving her the power that Thomas had stripped away. And in that moment of profound stillness, with the wind shrieking its lonely song outside, she knew she could not build a future with this man on a foundation of secrets. If she were to accept his silent invitation, he had to know exactly who he was welcoming into his arms. He had to know the full weight of the past she carried, the shame that had been branded onto her soul. She had to give him the same choice Thomas had had, the choice to turn away. Before, she began, her voice a raw, unsteady whisper. She had to stop and swallow, her throat tight with unshed tears. Before anything, you should know about me. He did not speak, but he inclined his head slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. It was all the encouragement she needed. She turned away from him then, unable to bear the intensity of his eyes while she spoke her shame aloud. She walked to the hearth and stared into the mesmerizing dance of the flames, gathering her courage. My mother was a seamstress, she began, her voice gaining a little strength as she spoke of the one person she had truly loved. She was the finest I have ever known. Her hands, they could make beauty out of anything. A scrap of silk, a yard of plain wool. She taught me everything. How to make a stitch so strong it would never break. How to read the grain of a fabric. How to make a garment that felt like it was made for you and you alone. She was a good woman. She was kind and proud, and she worked harder than anyone I have ever known. She paused, the firelight blurring through the film of tears in her eyes. This was the hardest part. She was not married, Isabel said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. My father, I never knew him. He was a wealthy man, just passing through. He left, and he never looked back. My last name is my mother's name. There is no other. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to hold herself together as the old, familiar shame washed over her. In Ohio, where I am from, that is a stain that does not wash out. I am illegitimate. The word followed me my whole life, in whispers. I tried to pretend it did not matter. I fell in love with a man, and I believed he loved me. We were to be married. She did not have to say Thomas's name. He was a faceless ghost, but the pain he had inflicted was real and present. After my mother died, he found out the truth about my birth. He said that a man in his position had to consider his reputation. He said his family would not understand. He looked at me as if I were something spoiled, something to be discarded. Her voice broke on the last word. So I came here, to be somewhere no one knew my name, to be somewhere that word couldn't follow me. She finished, Her confession laid bare. She stood with her back to him, trembling, bracing herself for the inevitable shift in the air, the polite withdrawal, the quiet judgment. She waited for him to say that he understood, that perhaps it was best if she went back to her room. She waited for the sound of his footsteps retreating. But all she heard was the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. The silence stretched, becoming a taut, humming wire of suspense. She could not bear it. She squeezed her eyes shut, convinced she had made a terrible mistake, that she had shattered the beautiful, fragile thing that had been growing between them. Then she heard a soft sound, not of footsteps, but of cloth moving, a soft rasp of buttons being undone. Slowly, she turned around. Jack was standing in the same spot, but he had unbuttoned the front of his flannel shirt. In the warm, flickering light of the fire, she saw it, a scar. It was not a small thing, but a long, jagged line that ran from just below his collarbone, diagonally across the hard muscle of his chest, and disappeared under his arm. It was an old wound, the edges silvery and puckered against his skin. A permanent, violent disruption of the man he was. It spoke of a pain and a past she could not even imagine, a story written on his body in a language of pure survival. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his shirt open, revealing this broken part of himself to her. He was answering her vulnerability not with words, but with his own. He finally looked down at the scar on his own chest, and then his eyes, clear and direct, rose to meet hers. Everyone has a past that's been cast aside. Isabel, he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. A piece of them that someone, somewhere, decided wasn't good enough. What matters is who dares to keep living. They stood there for a long time, looking at each other across the warm, shadowed space. The storm raged outside, a wild and impotent fury against the thick walls of the house. But inside, a profound and absolute stillness had fallen. In his eyes, she saw no pity. She saw no judgment. She saw only a deep and unwavering understanding. He was not a man who was afraid of scars. He was showing her that he had his own, and that they did not define him, just as hers did not define her. He was not just accepting her past, he was validating her survival, the shame she had carried for so long. The heavy, suffocating cloak of another person's prejudice began to unravel. In its place, a new feeling began to bloom, something light and warm and breathtakingly hopeful. It was the feeling of being truly seen. She did not go back to her room that night. The decision was made without a single word. It was made in the long, silent look that passed between them, a look that said everything that needed to be said. He held out a hand, not to pull her forward, but simply to offer. She took a step, and then another, and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, his calloused palm warm and strong against her own. He did not lead her to the bedroom. He simply stood with her before the fire, holding her hand, letting the warmth of the flames and the quiet strength of his presence wash over her, giving her this last moment to be sure. And she was sure. With her other hand, the one that was not held in his, she slowly, deliberately, reached for the top button of her gray wool dress. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a kind of reverent anticipation. She undid the first button, and then the second. The sounds were impossibly loud in the quiet room, the soft scrape of the button through the hole, the whisper of the wool. His eyes never left her face, his expression one of infinite tenderness. He was letting her lead, letting this be her choice, her story. As she worked her way down the front of the dress, and the warm firelight touched the skin of her throat, her collarbones, she felt the last of her shame fall away with the garment. Trust had always been a mistake, a prelude to pain. It had been a weakness, but in this room, with this man, it felt like the truest and most honest thing she had ever known. For the first time, in the deepest part of her soul, she did not feel wrong for trusting. She felt found. The blizzard broke as quietly as it had begun. Isabel awoke not to the shriek of the wind, but to a profound, almost sacred silence. The world outside the small bedroom window of the main house was a new creation, sculpted from pure, immaculate white under a sky of brilliant, aching blue. The sun on the snow was so bright it was blinding, a clean, unforgiving light that seemed to search out every corner of the world, leaving no room for shadows or secrets. She was in Jack's bed. She had woken in the night to find herself wrapped not just in the heavy warmth of his quilts, but in the solid, steady presence of his arms. There had been no awkwardness in the morning, only a quiet, shared intimacy that felt as natural as breathing. He had risen before her, stoking the fire in the kitchen hearth, and when she emerged, shyly clutching a blanket around her, he had simply handed her a mug of hot coffee, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a slow, warm smile that was just for her. They did not speak of what had passed between them. The words felt clumsy and inadequate for the deep, silent understanding that had been forged in the heart of the storm. They moved around the kitchen in a comfortable orbit, a new and untested rhythm. He made breakfast, thick slices of bacon and skillet fried potatoes, while she found Jebediah's sourdough starter and mixed a batch of biscuits, her hands moving with the familiar, practiced grace of a skill learned in childhood. It felt less like a new beginning and more like a continuation of something that had always been waiting for them. When the time came for her to leave, to cross the now silent yard back to her own small room, a flicker of the old fear returned. This was the moment of truth, the transition from the sheltered, fire-lit world of the night to the harsh reality of the day. He walked with her to the door. "I'll have one of the boys clear a path to your cabin," he said, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Thank you." He reached out and gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. His expression was serious, his gray eyes clear and steady. There are no secrets on a ranch this size, Isabel. It was not a warning, but a statement of fact, a preparation. She knew what he meant. The hands would know she had not spent the night in her own room. The geography of their small, isolated world made secrets impossible. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. "I know," she whispered. He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, then released her. "I'll see you later." She nodded and stepped out onto the porch, the brilliant, cold air a shock against her warm skin. As she made her way through the deep snow, following the freshly shoveled path, one of the hands was already clearing. She saw young Billy emerge from the bunkhouse, heading for the stables. He saw her. His eyes went from her to the main house she had just left, and then back to her. A look of pure, unadulterated surprise crossed his freckled face before he quickly ducked his head and hurried on his way, a sudden flush of red coloring his ears. The whisper had begun. For a few days, nothing seemed to change. The rhythm of the ranch resumed, the men digging out from the storm, their voices loud and cheerful in the crisp, clean air. They were still polite to her. They still tipped their hats when she crossed the yard. But something was different. The easy camaraderie she had begun to feel from a distance had been replaced by a new and careful reserve. Their glances were quicker now, more furtive. They looked at her, and then they looked away. The hook outside her door, which before the storm had been a constant, revolving repository of the ranch's needs, remained empty. One day passed, then two, then three. The canvas sack of new mending that should have appeared never did. The ripped shirts and torn trousers that were the inevitable consequence of their work were, it seemed, being mended by other, less skilled hands, or not at all. Her work, the very purpose of her being there, had dried up. The silence from the wives of the married hands was even more profound. Before the storm, they had been her most reliable customers, sending their husbands' town clothes or their children's worn-out playthings for her to repair. One of them, a cheerful, round-faced woman named Sarah Miller, had even sent a note with a pair of her husband's trousers, complimenting Isabel on her fine stitch work. Now, there was nothing, The isolation she felt was a different kind than the simple loneliness of her arrival. This was a deliberate, calculated exclusion. It was the same cold shoulder she had been shown in Ohio, the same silent, suffocating judgment. She had thought she had left that world behind, but it seemed it had followed her here, to this wild and empty place. The old shame, which had receded into a dull ache in Jack's presence, began to throb with a fresh, sharp pain. She found herself staying in her room, the emptiness of her work table a constant, mocking reproach. The four walls that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a cage. Jack knew. He said nothing, but she could feel his awareness of it in the way he watched her. He saw the untouched sewing on her table when he brought her a pail of fresh water. He saw the unnatural stillness of her days. He saw the old, haunted look returning to her eyes. One evening, he came to her door. He did not knock, but simply stood in the frame, his large presence filling the small space. She was sitting in her chair, staring at the wall, her hands idle in her lap. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a request. She followed him without a word. He led her away from the main yard, up a small rise that overlooked the entire ranch. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of soft pink and deep violet. The beauty of it was so intense it was painful. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the light fade. "I can give you enough money to get back to Ohio," he said finally, his voice quiet, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "More than enough. I can take you to the station myself. No one has to know anything more than you were hired for the winter and now you're going home." Her heart clenched. It was happening again. He was giving her an escape, a polite dismissal, just as Thomas had. He was casting her off. She turned on him, a hot, bitter anger rising in her throat. "Is that what you want for me to leave?" He turned to face her then, and in the fading light she saw the deep, aching sadness in his eyes. It was not the look of a man who was getting rid of a problem. It was the look of a man who was trying to protect something precious, even if it meant cutting out his own heart. "What I want," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not hide, "is for you to be happy, for you to lose that look in your eyes that you've had for the last 3 days. This place, these people, they have their ways, they have their rules. It's a hard life, and they hold on to what they think is right. I brought you into it, and I won't have you be hurt because of me. If you want to leave, Isabel, I will understand. I will." And then she understood. This was not a rejection. It was a sacrifice. He was willing to let her go, to face the loneliness of his own life once more, if it meant she would be safe from the whispers and the judgment. He was offering her freedom, at his own expense. In Ohio, she had been alone. Her shame was hers to bear in solitude. When Thomas had cast her aside, there had been no one to stand with her. She had been a solitary tree in a storm, and she had broken. But here, she was not alone. She had Jack. His quiet, unwavering strength was a shield she had never known. He was not asking her to leave for his sake, but for hers, and in that selfless, painful offer, she found the one thing she had been missing, the courage to stay. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady in the cold, still air. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "My whole life," she said, her gaze as direct and unwavering as his. "I have let other people's whispers decide who I am. I have hidden. I have run away. I am tired of running. Jack, I am tired of being ashamed of something that was never my fault." She took a step closer to him. "What they are saying, is it the truth? Did I spend the night of the storm under your roof?" "Yes," he said, his voice low. "Then I will not hide from it," she declared. The words felt momentous, a line drawn in the snow, a flag planted in the hard, frozen ground of her own soul. "I will not be a secret you keep in a cabin by the barn." The next morning, Isabel acted on her resolve. She did not wait for anyone's permission. She rose early, her purpose a hot, steady flame inside her. She went to her small cabin and began to move. First, she took her spools of thread, her tins of buttons and needles, her mother's shears. She carried them across the yard, her head held high, and brought them into the main house. There was a small, unused room just off the kitchen, a pantry that had been cleared out long ago. It was small, but it had a good window for light. She went back for her work table. It was heavy, and she struggled with it, her boots slipping in the snow. Young Billy, on his way to the morning meal, saw her struggling and stopped, his face a picture of uncertainty. He looked toward the bunkhouse, then back at her. For a moment, he seemed about to turn away. Then, his better nature won out. With a sigh of resignation, he came over. "Here, ma'am," he mumbled, not quite meeting her eye. "Let me get that for you." Together, they carried the table into the house and set it up in the small room by the kitchen. Jebediah watched the entire proceeding from his stove, his face an unreadable mask. He said nothing, but when she was finished, he silently handed her a fresh, hot cup of coffee. She had moved her workshop. She had moved her life from the periphery of the ranch to its very heart. She was no longer the seamstress in the cabin. She was Isabel, in the house. She was making her presence not just known, but undeniable. And then she sat at her table, in her new room, and she waited. For 2 days, nothing happened. The silence continued, but her resolve did not waver. She was no longer waiting for their approval, but for their necessity. She knew this land, this life. It was hard. It was unforgiving. It tore seams and broke buttons. Sooner or later, their judgment would have to yield to their practical needs. On the 3rd day, there was a hesitant knock on the kitchen door. Isabel looked up from the shirt of Jack's she was mending. Jebediah grunted and wiped his hands on his apron. Pulling the door open, Sarah Miller stood on the threshold, her round face pinched with an unhappy resolve. She was clutching a heavy winter coat. She did not look at Jebediah, but peered past him, her eyes finding Isabel in the small room beyond. "I need to speak with her, Mrs." Miller said, her voice tight. Jebediah stepped aside, and the woman entered, her boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. She stopped at the doorway of Isabel's new workroom, her hands twisting the coat she held. She would not step inside. "I don't approve of this," she said, the words coming out in a rush, "of what you're doing. It's not right. A woman living openly with a man she's not married to. It sets a bad example." Isabel did not flinch. She did not defend herself. She simply met the other woman's gaze with a calm, quiet steadiness, and waited. "Mrs." Miller's righteous anger seemed to falter in the face of Isabel's silence. Her eyes dropped to the coat in her hands. "But my Henry? He ripped his good coat, the one he needs for the ride into town for supplies tomorrow. The seam is torn clear through, and my hands are too clumsy for this kind of work." Her shoulders slumped in defeat. "He'll catch his death if he goes without it." She held out the coat, an offering of truce, a surrender of principle to pragmatism. Isabel looked at the woman's troubled face, at the worn coat that smelled of the cold winter air, at the honest need that had finally triumphed over fear and judgment, and a slow, genuine smile touched her lips. She stood up, walked to the doorway, and gently took the heavy coat from Mrs. Miller's hands. "I can fix this," she said, her voice soft and clear. "It will be ready for him in the morning." Sarah Miller's coat was a beginning. It was not a floodgate, but a small, creaking crack in the dam of public opinion. A few days later, another woman came, this one more hesitant, her eyes darting around the kitchen as if she were committing a crime. She brought a child's dress with a ripped hem. Isabel took it without a word of judgment. The flow of work was no longer a torrent, but it was a trickle, and a trickle was enough. It was a sign that necessity, in this hard land, would always, eventually, win out over piety. Her life settled into a new pattern, one woven between the public space of her workroom and the private world she shared with Jack. Their relationship was a quiet, unspoken thing, a language of shared glances over the supper table, of his hand finding hers for a brief, warm moment in the shadowed hallway, of the comforting weight of his arm around her as they slept. He did not make grand pronouncements or declarations. He simply made a place for her in his life, a space as solid and real as the house itself. She was no longer a guest or an employee. She was a fixture, a part of the landscape, as constant as the rising sun. The winter began its slow, grudging retreat. The snow melted under a strengthening sun, revealing the muddy, thawing earth beneath. The world, which had been a study in black and white, began to show hints of brown and gray, the promise of green still a distant dream. With the thawing of the roads came the return of the outside world. Supply wagons from town made their way to the ranch with more regularity, and with them, news and strangers. It was on one such afternoon, when the air held the first, faint, earthy scent of spring, that he arrived. Isabel was in her workroom, replacing the worn leather elbow patches on one of Jack's older jackets. The kitchen door was propped open to let in the fresh air, and she could hear Jack's low, even tones as he spoke with a visitor on the porch. Business, from the sound of it. The ranch was known for its fine breeding stock, and horse traders were a common sight. She paid the conversation little mind, her focus on the steady, rhythmic push and pull of her needle. Then the men's voices grew closer. They were coming inside. She heard their boots on the wooden floor of the kitchen, Jack's heavy and familiar, the other's lighter, quicker, the sound of city-made shoes on the rough-hewn planks. The stud is a pure Morgan line, out of Blackhawk. Jack was saying, he's got the temperament and the bone. I'll show you the yearlings after we get the paperwork sorted. Excellent, the other man replied. His voice was smooth, educated, with a carefully modulated tone that was designed to impress and persuade. It was a voice that belonged in a drawing room or a bank, not a ranch kitchen. And it was a voice that stopped the blood in Isabel's veins. Her needle froze in mid-stitch. Every muscle in her body went rigid. It couldn't be. It was a trick of memory, a ghost summoned from the darkest corners of her past. She told herself it was impossible, that the world was not that small or that cruel. But then he stepped into the doorway of her workroom, following Jack, and the ghost took on flesh and blood. It was Thomas Crowley. He looked different, yet achingly the same. He was dressed in a tailored traveling suit of expensive gray wool, a stark contrast to the practical denim and flannel of the ranch. His dark hair was perfectly combed, his face clean-shaven, his hands soft and manicured. He was the picture of refined, urban success. He was everything Jack was not. He was a man who lived by contracts and coin, in a world of smooth surfaces and polite lies. His eyes swept the small workroom, a flicker of dismissive curiosity in their depths. They passed over the spools of thread, the pile of mending, and then they landed on her. For a single, shattering second, his mask of pleasantry fell away. His eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly in a silent gasp of disbelief. He recognized her. In that unguarded instant, she saw it all, the shock, the annoyance, the immediate, cold calculation of a man confronted with an unwelcome complication. And then, just as quickly, the mask was back in place, his expression smoothed over, becoming a placid, unreadable blank. He looked directly at her, at the woman he had once sworn to love, the woman whose heart he had shattered, and his eyes were the eyes of a perfect stranger. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, the kind a man might give to a servant he did not know. And then he turned his attention back to Jack, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air in her lungs turned to ice. It was not just a rejection. It was an erasure. He was denying her very existence, wiping clean the slate of their shared past with a single, contemptuous glance. The pain of it was so sharp, so sudden, it was like a physical blow. The old, familiar shame rose up, hot and suffocating, threatening to drown her. Her hand, the one holding the needle, began to tremble violently. Jack had seen it. He had been watching Thomas, but his attention, as always, was attuned to her. He saw the way she froze, the color draining from her face, the tremor in her hand. He saw the flicker of recognition in Thomas Crowley's eyes, and he saw the deliberate, chilling dismissal that followed. He did not know the man's name or the story that connected them, but he saw the casual cruelty of the act, and he saw the wound it inflicted on Isabel. A dangerous stillness came over Jack. It was a subtle thing, a slight hardening of his jaw, a narrowing of his eyes, the kind of quiet that precedes a sudden, violent storm. He did not look at Isabel. He kept his gaze fixed on Thomas, but his entire being had become a shield, placed squarely between her and the man who had hurt her. This is Isabel Faraday," Jack said, his voice dangerously soft. The slight hesitation was telling. He did not know how to define her to a stranger, but he would be damned if he let her be ignored. "She handles the mending for the ranch." Thomas turned, his smile perfectly polite, perfectly empty. "A pleasure," he said, the words a meaningless courtesy. He did not look at Isabel again. He turned back to Jack. "All business. Now, about those yearlings. You said you have their lineage papers." "In the office," Jack said, his voice flat. He gestured for Thomas to precede him. As Thomas walked past, Jack's eyes met Isabel's over the other man's shoulder. His gaze was a silent question. "Are you all right?" And in their gray depths, she saw a cold, protective fury that was all for her. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a lie that she hoped would be enough for now. He held her gaze for another moment, then turned and followed Thomas from the room, leaving Isabel alone in the ringing silence. She sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. She set the jacket aside, her hands shaking too much to continue her work. She stared at the empty doorway, her mind reeling. Of all the places, all the people, the past she had run 1,000 miles to escape had just walked into her kitchen. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of suspended animation. She could hear the low murmur of their voices from Jack's small office, the sound of papers rustling, the clink of glasses. Later, she saw them from her window, walking toward the corrals. Jack's long, confident stride, a stark contrast to Thomas's careful, city steps. They stood by the fence for a long time, Jack pointing out horses, Thomas nodding, his posture that of a man appraising livestock, merchandise to be bought and sold. The sight of him standing there, in her new world, felt like a violation. He did not belong here. He was a disease from her old life, a contagion of shame and heartbreak. She felt a desperate, primal urge for him to be gone, to take his smooth voice and his empty eyes and disappear forever. When they finally came back to the house, Jack saw him to the door. Their handshake was brief, a purely professional gesture. "I'll have my man draw up the contracts and have them sent over from town tomorrow," Thomas said, his voice carrying on the still afternoon air. "Fine," was Jack's curt reply. Thomas mounted his fine, polished horse, a creature as groomed and pristine as he was, and rode away without a backward glance. The silence he left behind was heavy with unspoken things. That night, the meal in the kitchen was a tense affair. Jack was quiet, his mood dark and brooding. He ate without seeming to taste his food, his gaze often drifting to her, his brow furrowed with a protective anger that he was struggling to contain. She knew he was waiting for her to speak, to offer an explanation, but she did not know where to begin. How could she explain the weight of a life's worth of shame to a man who had never been ashamed of anything? After the meal, they sat before the fire, just as they had on the night of the storm, but the comfortable, intimate silence was gone. In its place was a taut, humming tension. Jack stared into the flames, one hand clenching and unclenching on the arm of his chair. He was a man coiled, ready to strike, but with no enemy in sight. She knew he was ready to fight for her. He would have called Thomas out, would have thrown him off the ranch if she had given him the slightest sign. He would have torn down the world to protect her from that look of casual dismissal. And the fierce, unwavering loyalty of it filled her with a warmth so profound it almost brought her to tears. But she also knew that if she let him fight this battle for her, she would remain a victim. She would be the broken thing he had to protect, the wounded bird he had to shelter. Thomas had taken her power once. She would not let his memory, his ghost, allow her to give it away again. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on his, on the fist that was clenched so tightly on the arm of the chair. Her touch was light, tentative. He started, as if pulled from a great distance, and looked at her. The anger in his eyes was still there, a banked fire, but it was mingled with a deep, aching concern. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, his grip strong and reassuring. "You don't have to tell me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's none of my business." "But it is," she whispered. "He is the man I told you about, the one from Ohio." Understanding dawned in his eyes, and his grip on her hand tightened almost painfully. The anger in his face hardened into a cold, dangerous mask. If he ever sets foot on this ranch again. "No," she said, her voice suddenly firm. She squeezed his hand, demanding his full attention. He looked at her, his eyes questioning. "Listen to me, Jack," she said, her gaze holding his. "When he looked at me today, when he pretended I was a stranger, I felt small. I felt ashamed. For a moment, I was that same girl he left behind in that parlor full of dying flowers. And then I saw you, and I saw the look on your face, and I knew that you would protect me." She paused, gathering her strength for what she needed to say next. "But you don't have to," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You don't have to protect me from him. I am not that girl anymore. He has no power over me here. He is just a ghost, and this is not his world. It's ours." She leaned forward, her expression earnest, willing him to understand the importance of her words. "I am not here because I was running away from him. Not anymore. I am here because I chose to be here. I chose this life. I chose you. What he thinks, what he does, it doesn't matter. It cannot touch me here unless I let it. And I won't." She had finally said it. The truth she had only just come to realize herself. Her presence here was not an accident of fate, not a desperate flight from a painful past. It was a choice, a deliberate, conscious act of will. She had chosen this hard, beautiful, honest life, and she had chosen the hard, beautiful, honest man who was its heart. The anger in his face slowly dissolved, replaced by a look of wonder, of profound and tender understanding. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "All right, Isabel," he murmured against her skin. "All right." The coil of tension inside him finally unwound. He was still her protector. She knew he always would be. But in that moment, she had become something more. She had become his partner. They would face the ghosts of the past not as a guardian and his ward, but as equals, standing together, shoulder to shoulder, against whatever came next. Thomas Crowley's contracts were signed the next day by one of his clerks from town, and he did not return to the ranch. His presence lingered for a day or two like a bad smell, a ghostly stain on the air, but then, like all unpleasant things, it faded. The world moved on. The sun grew warmer, the mud began to dry, and the first stubborn green shoots of spring grass appeared on the south-facing slopes. Isabel's declaration to Jack had been a turning point, a private treaty signed between her present and her past. But she knew that a private peace was not enough. To truly be free, she had to be as fearless in the full light of day as she was in the fire-lit intimacy of their home. The opportunity came with the announcement of the Dust River Winter Fair. It was the last major gathering before the spring thaws would turn the roads into impassable quagmires. A final chance for the scattered, isolated communities to come together for trade and talk. It was a day for selling livestock, for stocking up on supplies, for gossip and games of chance, for sizing up your neighbors and showing off your wares. It was the beating heart of the town's social life, a place where every action was noted, every word was weighed, and every reputation was on public display. When Isabel announced her intention to set up a mending stall at the fair, Jebediah nearly dropped a cast-iron skillet, and even Jack's normally unreadable expression flickered with surprise. "You don't have to do that," he said that evening, his voice carefully neutral. They were sitting on the porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo sky. "Your work here is enough." "It's not about the work," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the distant, dark line of the hills. "Or the money. It's about standing my ground. I can't live in the heart of this house and still be a ghost in the town." He was silent for a long time, the only sound the soft creak of his rocking chair. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "People will stare, they'll whisper." "Let them," she replied, and the words were not a boast, but a simple statement of fact. She turned to look at him, her face serene in the twilight. "You taught me not to be afraid of scars. Jack, I think it's time I showed them mine." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. He did not try to dissuade her again. He understood. This was a battle she had to fight for herself. On the morning of the fair, a nervous energy thrummed through her, a mixture of terror and exhilarating resolve. She dressed carefully, not in her finest clothes, but in her sturdiest work dress, a deep blue calico, clean and neatly pressed. She tied on a crisp white apron, a suit of armor for the day ahead. She gathered her tools, her mother's shears, her box of threads and needles, her tin of buttons. She had painted a small, simple sign on a piece of smoothed plank. I, Faraday, seamstress, mending and repairs. Jack loaded her small table and chair into the back of the wagon. He said little, but his presence was a constant, steadying force. He checked her supplies, made sure she had a heavy blanket for her lap and a small metal brazier with a sack of charcoal to ward off the chill. His quiet, practical care was his way of saying everything that mattered. The town of Dust River was transformed. The single muddy street was thronged with people, with wagons and horses. The air was a cacophony of sound, the shouts of traders, the laughter of children, the whinny of horses, the lively, slightly off-key tune of a fiddle coming from a makeshift stage. Stalls lined the street, selling everything from brightly colored quilts to hefty iron tools. The smell of roasting meat and sugary treats mingled with the familiar sense of livestock and wood smoke. Isabel's heart hammered against her ribs. Every person here was a potential juror in the court of public opinion. Jack drove the wagon directly into the main square, the most visible, most central part of the fair. He helped her unload her things and set up her stall, not in a quiet corner or a discreet side alley, but right in the open, near the town's central water pump. She was not on the edge of the community. She was placing herself squarely in its center. He gave her hand a final, firm squeeze. "I have to see a man about a bull," he said, his voice low. "I'll be back." He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a fierce, proud light. And then he turned and strode into the crowd, leaving her alone. The moment he was gone, she felt 1,000 eyes on her. The cheerful noise of the fair seemed to fade, replaced by a focused, humming silence around her small stall. She could feel the stares, the nudges, the hands cupped over mouths as whispers passed from one person to another. There she is, the seamstress from the Holt Ranch, the one who lives with him. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and sat down in her chair. She arranged her tools on the table, her hands moving with a deliberate, practiced calm she did not feel. She took a half-finished piece of mending from her bag and began to stitch. Forcing her trembling fingers to obey, she fixed her gaze on the needle, on the tiny, perfect stitches forming in the cloth, and she shut out the world. An hour passed. It felt like a lifetime. People walked by, their footsteps slowing as they approached her stall, their curiosity warring with their sense of propriety. Some women would steer their husbands in a wide arc around her. A group of young, rough-looking men snickered as they passed, their comments low and crude. No one stopped. No one spoke to her. She was an island in the middle of a bustling sea, utterly and completely alone. Doubt, cold and insidious, began to creep in. This was a mistake. She had been foolish, arrogant. She had mistaken one man's acceptance for the world's. The shame she had resolved to conquer threatened to rise again, a bitter tide in her throat. Her stitches became less certain, her vision blurring. And then, through the crowd, she saw him. Jack was walking toward her, moving with a calm, unhurried purpose that parted the sea of people before him. He was not dressed in his dusty work clothes. He wore dark trousers, polished boots, and a clean flannel shirt, and slung over his arm was a heavy wool coat. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the coat she had mended for him on one of her first days at the ranch, the one with the sleeve nearly torn from its socket. It was a symbol of her purpose, of her skill, of the very beginning of the quiet respect that had grown between them. He did not stop at the edge of the invisible circle of judgment that surrounded her. He walked right through it, his gaze fixed only on her. The whispers around them faltered and died, replaced by a stunned, watchful silence. The entire fair seemed to hold its collective breath. He stopped in front of her table. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his eyes full of a love and pride so fierce it made her dizzy. He laid the coat on the corner of her table, a silent offering, a reminder of who she was. And then, in front of God and the entire population of Dust River, he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold and stiff, but his were warm and strong, his grasp firm and sure. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, and then he turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the watching crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried across the silent square with the authority of absolute conviction. "This is Isabel Faraday," he said, his eyes finding and holding the gazes of the town's most prominent gossips, of Sarah Miller, of men who did business with him every day. "This is the woman I live with." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. He tightened his grip on her hand. "She is the woman I choose." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a declaration, a challenge, a line drawn not in the snow, but in the hard-packed earth of their community. He was not apologizing, not explaining. He was stating a fact as immutable as the mountains on the horizon. He had chosen her, and by doing so, he dared them to stand against him. He turned back to her then, his attention solely on her, the rest of the world falling away. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not need to. He simply held her hand, offering his strength, his conviction, his unwavering belief in her. And in that moment, something inside Isabel that had been broken for a lifetime finally, irrevocably, healed. The fear did not vanish, but it no longer had power over her. She felt the warmth from his hand spread up her arm and through her entire body, a current of courage. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the shocked, the disapproving, the curious, the conflicted, and for the first time, she felt no shame. She did not pull her hand away. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her spine straight, her head held high. She stood beside him, their joined hands a symbol of their union, a testament to their choice. For the first time in her life, she was not hiding in the shadows or flinching from the judgment of others. For the first time, she stood in the middle of a crowd and felt not the crushing weight of their opinion, but the solid strength of her own worth. She was Isabel Faraday. She was a seamstress. She was the woman Jack Holt chose. She was tall, she was strong, and her hand was being held. The silence stretched, thick and profound. Then, a figure detached itself from the crowd. It was Sarah Miller. Her face was a mixture of apprehension and resolve. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the stall, her neighbors watching her every step. She stopped in front of the table, her eyes shifting from Jack's resolute face to Isabel's calm one. She held out a small, bundled-up piece of cloth. It was a little girl's bonnet, its ribbon torn. "My daughter's favorite, Mrs." Miller said, her voice a little shaky, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "She won't wear any other. I was wondering if you might have the time to fix it." Isabel looked at the offering, at the simple, honest piece of mending. It was more than a bonnet. It was a white flag. It was an acceptance. She gently released Jack's hand and took the small garment from Sarah Miller. "Of course," Isabel said, and her voice, like her heart, was steady and strong. "I have all the time in the world." The winter fair was not an end, but a beginning. Jack's public declaration and Isabel's quiet courage had not magically erased all prejudice, but they had shifted the very ground beneath the town's feet. They had replaced the foundation of whispered gossip with a new, solid bedrock of undeniable fact. In the days and weeks that followed, the change was palpable. It was not in grand apologies or dramatic reversals, but in 1,000 small, quiet gestures. The trickle of mending work became a steady, respectable stream. Women who had once averted their eyes would now offer a tight, small nod as she passed in the street. The men from the bunkhouse, who had treated her with a careful, almost fearful distance, began to relax. Young Billy would now bring her a cup of coffee from the kitchen without being asked, a blush still coloring his ears. But his eyes would meet hers with a newfound respect. She was no longer just a subject of speculation. She was a woman who had stood her ground. And in this hard country, there was nothing more respected than strength. Her life with Jack blossomed in the quiet spaces, away from the watching eyes of the world, with the specter of Thomas Crowley banished and the judgment of the town face down. The last of the shadows that had clung to her soul seemed to dissolve. Laughter came more easily to her now, a sound that Jack cherished, his eyes lighting up whenever he heard it. She learned the rhythms of his moods, the way a muscle in his jaw would tighten when he was worried about a horse, the soft, contented sigh he would let out when they sat together before the fire at the end of a long day. He, in turn, learned her. He learned the language of her hands, the way they moved with such grace and precision when she was at her work. He learned the quiet strength in her, the deep, resilient core that had allowed her to survive so much. He would often just watch her, a look of quiet wonder on his face, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. As the last of the snow melted and the plains turned from brown to a soft, vibrant green, Isabel felt a deep and abiding sense of peace. She had a home, she had work that gave her purpose, and she had the love of a good, quiet man. It was more than she had ever dared to dream of. One sun-drenched afternoon, with the air sweet with the scent of thawing earth and new grass, she found herself drawn back to the small cabin by the barn. It had stood empty since she had moved into the main house, a silent monument to her arrival. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was cool and smelled of dust and old wood. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating the empty space where her work table had once stood, the bare pegs on the wall where her few clothes had hung. She ran a hand along the rough wooden wall, the one that separated the room from the stables. She remembered the comfort she had taken from the sounds of the horses, their soft sighs and gentle movements a lullaby in the lonely darkness. She had been so frightened then, so brittle and bruised, it felt like a lifetime ago. Her eyes fell upon a single hook by the door, and hanging from it, forgotten in the whirlwind of the past few months, was the dress. Her gray wool dress, the one she had worn on the train, the one that had been her uniform of quiet survival, the one she had been wearing on the night of the storm, when she had asked her foolish, desperate question and he had given his staggering, life-altering answer. She took it down from the hook, The wool was coarse and practical, the color of a sky heavy with unshed rain. It smelled of wood smoke and the faint, lingering scent of the past. She held it up, and in her mind's eye, she saw the woman who had worn it, a pale, timid creature, her shoulders hunched against the cold and the cruelty of the world, her eyes full of a quiet, desperate plea to simply be left alone. She felt a wave of tenderness for that woman, a surge of compassion for all her fear and all her pain. She was no longer that woman, but she would not have become who she was now without her. That gray dress had been her armor, her camouflage. It had kept her safe until she was strong enough to no longer need it. She carried it back to the main house. Through the bright, hopeful sunshine, she did not take it to her room to be folded away in a chest. Instead, she walked to the front door of the house, the main entrance that looked out over the entire ranch, and she hung the dress on the heavy iron hook just inside the frame. It hung there, simple and plain, a piece of her history displayed not in shame, but in acknowledgement. It was a testament to the journey she had taken, a reminder of the long, hard road that had led her here, to this place of safety and love. She would not wear it again, not because it was a reminder of a painful time, but because it belonged to a different person. Its purpose was served. It was a relic of a life she had survived, not one she was still living. The next day, she began to make a new one. Jack had ridden to town for supplies and had come back with a bolt of cloth as a surprise for her. It was a soft, fine wool, the color of a deep, rich wine, the kind of vibrant, unapologetic red that the old Isabel would have never dared to wear. She had gasped when she saw it, her hands stroking the beautiful fabric. He had just smiled, a slow, warm smile that told her he saw her, not as the pale gray ghost who had arrived on the train, but as the vibrant, living woman she was becoming. She set up her workspace in her small room off the kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the window, illuminating the fine, red wool. For the first time, she was not mending something broken. She was not repairing the ravages of a hard life. She was creating. She was making something new, something beautiful, something just for herself. The work filled her with a deep and quiet joy. Her mother had always said that sewing was a kind of magic, the act of turning a flat, lifeless piece of cloth into something with form and purpose and beauty. As she worked, she felt a profound connection to her mother, not through the legacy of shared sorrow, but through the legacy of shared creation. She chose a spool of pure white thread, the color of the snow on the morning after the storm, the color of a clean, new beginning. Her needle flew, her stitches small and perfect, not just because it was her craft, but because it was an act of love. She was stitching together all the pieces of her new life, the peace, the acceptance, the quiet strength she had found in this place, the deep, abiding love she felt for the man who had given it all to her. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear him come in. She only knew he was there when his shadow fell over her, and then his warmth was behind her, his large, strong hands resting gently on her shoulders. She leaned back into his touch, her head resting against his solid chest, and let out a soft sigh of contentment. He was quiet for a long moment, simply holding her, watching her hands on the beautiful red fabric, the scent of him, of leather and horses and the clean outdoor air, enveloped her. "That's a fine piece of cloth," he said finally, his voice a low, warm rumble near her ear. He bent his head, his lips brushing against her hair, but the woman wearing it will be finer. A thrill, sharp and sweet, shot through her. A few months ago, such a compliment would have made her blush and look away, flustered and uncertain. But she was not that woman anymore. She had faced down her ghosts. She had claimed her place in the world, and she had learned the beautiful, liberating power of her own desires. She did not turn her head. She simply tilted it back slightly, her eyes still on the vibrant red dress that was a symbol of her new life. She smiled, a slow, confident smile that was all her own. And this time, It was she who took the lead. It was she who closed the distance. It was she who wrote the final, hopeful sentence of their new chapter. She turned in her chair then, twisting to face him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She looked directly into his clear, gray eyes, and her own were shining with a love and a playful, confident fire that he had never seen before. "Then you'd best not let me wear it for long," she whispered. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.